While Frank Furness sought complexity and unconventional forms in his search for an American architecture, the opposite side of the coin will be Henry Hobson Richardson, who is going to follow Owen Jones's dictum that architecture requires repose. He, and not Furness, will become the model and inspiration for American architects in search of a truly American style of architecture at the end of the 19th century, eventually even becoming the first American architect to have influence on European architecture. Richardson, born in Louisiana and raised in New Orleans, had attended Harvard College from 1856 to 1859, originally intending to become an engineer. At Harvard, he developed a network of friends who would become his clients in the future. His interests had gradually shifted to architecture, however, and so his stepfather volunteered to pay to send him to Europe in the summer of 1859 so that he could study its buildings up close. After Great Britain, Richardson had moved on to Paris, where he decided to apply to study architecture at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he became the second American to do so, following in the footsteps of Richard Morris Hunt. He was accepted into the atelier of Jules Louis André Lebru's supervisor on the Bibliothèque Nationale, which we will see will ignite his interest in the design of American libraries. His family's financial resources were drained during the first part of the Civil War, however, which forced him to leave the school and seek employment in Paris during the remainder of the Civil War in order to avoid the Confederate draft. He found employment in the office of Henri Lebrust's older brother, Théodore Lebrust, an expert on the design of hospitals until the end of the war. Meanwhile, he still attended lectures at the Beaux-Arts, absorbing its methodology of design that focused on clarity in planning and controlled massing. In fact, he was attending lectures at the Beaux-Arts during the unsuccessful efforts of Viollet-le-Duc to give a lecture there. We don't know if he was in attendance during any of his attempted lectures, but one would assume he wouldn't have wanted to miss the action. After the war, Richardson chose to return not to his native New Orleans, but to Boston, where he had a built-in client network of Harvard classmates, now in important business positions, but instead to New York City. What we will see in his work is a move away from the era's eclecticism to developing his own personal interpretation of French and Spanish Romanesque, echoing and maybe influenced by Gottfried Zemper's words about Romanesque, namely that the rise of the Gothic style had stopped the evolutionary development of Romanesque prematurely, so that there was still much room within the Romanesque vocabulary for further development. Richardson's growth as a designer will be the dialectic opposite of Furness. Where Furness continued to pursue more and more complex designs, Richardson will start with the complex, and seemingly inspired by Owen Jones's call for repose in architecture, will search for unity and simplicity in both form and color. His aesthetic will still be eclectic, as he will draw from French Romanesque, Spanish Romanesque, and the Byzantine, but he will truly synthesize these into his own style that will eventually be referred to as Richardsonian Romanesque. After floundering on his own for the better part of 2 years in New York City, he was taken on by Charles Gambrill, and Richardson broke into the national limelight on June 1, 1872, when it was announced that they had won the competition for the new Trinity Church in Boston, planned to be erected in the new Back Bay area's Art Square, whose name was changed to Copley Square in 1883, where Boston was planning to erect the country's first solely public art museum. 34-year-old Reverend Phillips Brooks, a Boston native and one of the country's rising Episcopalian stars, had just been named rector of the congregation and had begun the planning of a grand new church for a site the congregation had purchased in the nearly completed Back Bay neighborhood. Richardson had won the Trinity competition within a year of Furness winning the commission for Philadelphia's Academy of the Fine Arts, so you can see that, indeed, Richardson and Furness will parallel each other's careers as contemporaries. Although 6 architects had been invited to the competition, both Brooks and the chairman of the building committee had been Harvard classmates of Richardson, so one might say the deck was slightly stacked in Richardson's favor. His Beaux-Arts design process produced a Byzantine Greek cross plan that would provide more seats closer to the altar from where Brooks preferred to speak than would a traditional nave plan. His design planned for the first freestanding altar in the United States by placing an elongated semicircular apse at the sanctuary end. This was fleshed out into a pyramidal massing, culminating with a tall, monumental tower. But the tall tower would eventually be jettisoned over concerns that the reclaimed land of the Back Bay did not have sufficient bearing capacity for such a large load, and was replaced with a redesigned, shortened version inspired by a photo of a tower in the cathedral in Salamanca, Spain. Richardson then filled the triangular site by echeloning or diagonally sliding the rector's house with its cloister to one side. If you look at the church's front entry, there is no projected porch. That was added later after Richardson's premature death by his successor firm. Here's the first example of Richardson's highly picturesque rooflines, or what I call his medieval crown. We will see his spiky roofline slowly but carefully move from one of a dominant roof with turrets, which is what this is, to a dominant wall with angled gables. He will create this by running his wall surfaces vertically to intersect with the dormer's gable roof, but he will allow the wall to run past the roof, holding the roof behind the wall, such as you see where I have noted with arrows. The church contains a number of motifs that Richardson will continue to employ. First, large arches with cyclopean-sized voussoirs. Second, he will especially use these in a triumphal arched entry portal. Third, although still polychromatic in this building, he inverted the typical 1870s language of a dark body with light trim to a light body with dark stone trim. Fourth, most characteristic is the checkerboard motif of dark and light-colored square stones that infill the space between the arches voussoirs and the next upper horizontal layer. In the rector's house, once again we see his soon-to-be characteristic checkerboard motif, as well as a dark stone trim with a light stone body. Upon entering, one can easily perceive the spatial construct of a central lantern over a Greek cross plan with an apse for the sanctuary. Apparently, this was the second American building that had a themed interior, the first being the U.S. Capitol. Richardson wanted its interior to be a piece of color, following the period's leading theorists Pugin and Ruskin's ideas on the issues. And so he brought in the country's leading artist, John Lafarge, to design and supervise its execution, who also was commissioned to paint the first American mural. Richardson also imported stained glass from Britain's leading designer-producer, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. This view gives you a better sense of the lantern and the apse, but it is missing one of the major original elements. The corona, its polished brass gas jet chandelier for evening services. Imagine its golden glow in the darkness of a Boston winter. We can use Trinity as a starting point for Richardson's career to understand how he will search for repose or simplicity in form and color. In a way, this was his effort to derive a new modern American architecture, as simplicity in form and monochromatic surfaces were 180 degrees in opposition to the Victorian Gothic of the past generation. The church was finished in 1877, and in 1885, the American Institute of Architects voted it as the best building in the United States, and it will continue to be rated the best building for the next 10 years. In fact, Richardson will have designed 6 of the top 10 buildings so identified by his professional peers during his career. So obviously, American architects consider his buildings to be very well designed. So much so that he's going to be the first American architect to be copied by European architects. He will become America's leading designer in the early 1880s. I mentioned earlier that while he was studying in Paris, he had not only worked for Henri Lebroust's older brother, but maybe even more importantly, When he started at the Beaux-Arts, he chose to enter the atelier of Labrousse, construction supervisor for the Bibliothèque Nationale. So it's thought by Richardson scholars that he had developed a keen interest in this building typology when he was in Paris. We are going to look at 3 of his suburban libraries that he designed in chronological order, not only to understand how he evolved this typology, but also to understand, in a nutshell, how he evolved his architectural ideas generally. The first was designed in 1876, the Wynne Memorial Library in Woburn, Massachusetts, a northern suburb of Boston. Looking at its silhouette in the lower left, we see a very in vogue for 1876 additive scheme, where each major function has been given its own volumetric articulation. By additive, I mean simply that one form is located immediately next to its neighbor, as opposed to the classical tradition of using a simple geometric form and shoehorning the functions within the box. Instead of the light body of Trinity, he has returned to the more conventional polychrome scheme of a dark body with light-colored trim. He now has adopted the alternating colored voussoir arches that he will employ in a number of following buildings. In plan, in conjunction with the exterior views, you can see that each space has, indeed, been given its own form, although he has started to pull these together into simpler shapes. The plan has a biaxial concept. The long axis places the stacks at one end, while a museum is placed at the other end. The cross axis is the reading room wing that also contains the entrance, which is marked with the location of the stair tower turret. Compositionally, he plays a balancing game by making the longer of the 2 axes the shorter of the 2 masses, while the gable of the entry wing is dominant. Even though the tower is a vertical element, he tries to give the building a horizontal feel with a number of continuous horizontal lines that does tend to anchor it to the ground. Now we can introduce another Richardsonian motif of articulating each function by the use of specific fenestration or windows, as opposed to the classical tradition of having one type of window placed symmetrically around an elevation, a la the palazzos in Florence. He tells us what is happening on the other side of the walls through the type of window. This includes where the stairs are, located by the diagonal windows. So as we walk around the library, we can see where the stacks are with their slit windows for the shelves. Note the type of roofs, mostly gable, where again the wall is allowed to override the roof, but over the stack unit, he still employs a hip roof, the last time you will see this, as he moves to an architecture emphasizing the wall. Here you can see the alternating colored voussoirs. I've noted the projected piece of trim that he uses to denote that the stairs are contained in the turret. One detail I don't care for is the horizontal striping carried through the columns at the entry. Columns are vertical elements, and the horizontal striping conflicts, almost denies their inherent vertical character. The interior has a spacious barrel vault, warm wood paneling, and appropriate levels of lighting that come from the upper range of clerestory windows. The second library is his Oliver Eames Library in Northeastern Massachusetts, a southern suburb of Boston, designed in 1877. You can see how much he has changed in just 1 year. He still uses the cross-axial plan, but he has simplified the overall massing to 2 rectangular masses intersecting each other with the addition of the stair tower. The hip roof is gone. Both masses are covered with an extruded gable roof that has the same height on both masses. The roofs are overridden by the vertical extension of the walls. The wall's triangular form is now the dominant element in all 4 elevations. He uses his trademark triumphal arched entry, noted by the adjacent location of the stair tower once again. This not only signals the location of the entrance from afar, but is also a very convenient location, being immediately off the entry lobby. He has abandoned the experiment with the dark stone body of the last library and returned to his 70s color palette of a light body with dark trim that he had used with Trinity. He has also detailed his elevations as a horizontally layered composition. That is, the elevations have been articulated into a series of horizontal layers by continuous bands of dark stone trim, referred to either as a string course, or if it lines up with the sill of the windows, a sill course. You can read the horizontal layers now: water table, base, sill course, first floor, string course, second floor, cornice, roof. His exterior details are becoming standardized now: rock-faced ashlar and the oversized cyclopean voussoirs. The interior is a replay of the last library, a two-story central aisle spanned with a wooden barrel vault. The third library is the Thomas Crane Library, designed in 1880, located in Quincy, Massachusetts, another suburb to the south of Boston. You can see how much simpler this design is from the first one, even though it has the same plan concept, that is, a cross-axial plan, with the stacks and the reading room wing now being given dominance with a higher gable roof, unbroken by the lower subordinate volume of the entry's cross-axes. In fact, this volume is not even given articulation in the front elevation, as it exists only as the gable extension of the roof, as it uses the same elevational plane of the long axis. Only the requisite stair tower is allowed to project beyond the plane of the volume, but even this once proud vertical element has now been subordinated to the overall horizontal lines of the composition, which still reads quite clearly, doesn't it? You can easily see the different functions of the library expressed on its layered exterior. With one exception, I've marked where a string course is awkwardly discontinued at the stair tower and is not continued onto the reading room wall. This points to a conflict in Richardson's mind about the necessity of marking every floor level in the elevation. Keep this in mind, because it will be one of his inventions that will be revolutionary, that is, eliminating the banding of each floor on an elevation. You can see that he has subtly communicated the location of the stairs with the diagonally offset window trim stones. One last detail: the curved eyebrow dormers that appear to be just opening from the plane of the roof. Here are 3 images of the Wormwood Interior. So when I put all 3 libraries next to each other, Richardson's move to a simpler, smoother massing should be obvious to you. His volumes are getting simpler, moving closer to the regular forms of classical architecture. This is a great example of an architect coming to understand a particular building type through a series of theme and variations. The musical analogy is appropriate, and I will use it again. All that is left to do is to move to a simple rectangular volume and to eliminate the 2-color palette in favor of a monochromatic exterior. Keep your eyes open for this in the next series of buildings. You can see a similar change from highly active to repose in a series of houses that he designed at the same time. Historians say this is a change from Richardson designing in what was called the stick style to the shingle style. This is the Watts Sherman house in Newport, Rhode Island, that he designed in 1874, 2 years before the first library I showed you. It is a stick style house, an offshoot of Richard Norman Shaw's old English style houses. Richardson has made it as busy as he could, employing a plethora of extended chimneys, gables, and bay windows. It is called stick style because of the visible wooden structure and diagonal bracing that is infilled with stucco. But something happens around 1880. We'll see it first in his houses, where he can afford to experiment before he employs these lessons he's learned in larger, more expensive buildings. From the stick style, we move to the shingle style. I spent a great deal of time pointing out his layered elevations so that you could better understand what he will do with a shingled wall. The shingled wall is a membrane, like a roll of saran wrap, with which Richardson has wrapped the entire volume of the house. He has eliminated the horizontal lines of trim that he used to mark the various layers of the building. The building is now one homogeneous volume or form. What is very important to me in my research, which is the development of the Chicago skyscraper, is how the architects of the 1880s broke the tyranny of the horizontally layered elevation, where each floor had to be articulated by a continuous string course so that one could rotate their elevational accent to make it an unbroken vertical statement. This is where I have traced it back in history to these Shingle Style houses of Richardson, because the shingles allow him to express the volume of the building, and he no longer feels compelled to break the elevation into horizontal articulated layers with continuous bands. This is the Bryant house in Cohasset, Massachusetts, designed in 1880. Look carefully at its exterior. The floors are no longer marked. The surface is an unbroken plane, like I alluded to. He has simply wrapped the building's volume with this unbroken membrane. You'll even see it more clearly in the next house. This is the Stoughton House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, designed in 1882, after he returned from a 2-month-long tour of Europe during the spring and summer of 1882. He no longer felt compelled to put any articulation marking the floor line between the first and second stories. Once again, he's covered the house with these shingles as if it were a pliable membrane that he simply wraps the building's volume with. This is a critical moment in American architectural history for an architect to realize that I don't have to break a building's elevation at every floor level. Richardson has been given an honorific place in the development of the skyscraper, but as we will see in the next lecture, for the wrong reason. What we will see him bring to the design of a skyscraper is the freedom to not express the floor in a building's elevation. This eventually will permit other architects to give the taller skyscraper an unbroken verticality in its elevation. So my research says this idea first comes from Richardson's Shingle-style houses. Like his libraries, he uses the stair tower to denote the entry, but similar to the last library we looked at, he has subordinated the height of the tower, if we may call it that, so that he can allow the mass of the dominant horizontal to read clearly. In plan, he still uses the Arts and Craft L plan a la Pugin. It's still a cross-axial plan, like the libraries. One enters perpendicular to the long volume. The hall breaks this volume into the parlor library to the left and the dining kitchen to the right. This would have minimized the smell of food preparation, especially for visiting guests. To summarize these last two houses, the important change for me is the lack of any floor articulation in his houses designed in the early 1880s. Now, let's see if we can find these same ideas in the larger buildings he designed after the Stoughton House. The Eames Wholesale store in Boston was also designed after he returned from his European tour in 1882. Interestingly, it's his first large building that is monochromatic, just like the Shingle-style houses, where he painted the trim with the same color of the shingles. He has jettisoned the dark stone banding of the 1870s of his earlier buildings to achieve a monolithic surface. He will be one of the trendsetters in the early 1880s to move to monochromatic exteriors. The elevation he has articulated into horizontal layers, but note that these no longer directly correspond to each floor, but to groupings of floors. In other words, he has grouped floors into a layer, and then there are 3 layers: the base, the middle, and the top. However, in reality, as you see in the elevation, the gable roof is a 4th layer, but in this urban setting, you don't get back far enough to read it. The base has the higher sales floor, the middle and the upper layers have 2 floors each. This 3-part or tripartite composition is often compared to that of a classical column. This is a loose analogy, however, as one could be referring to the Ionic column that has a base, shaft, and capital, but the Greek Doric column has no base, so then we conveniently change the analogy to the Doric order of column, capital, and entablature. Here, Richardson also employed a fashionable motif that other American architects have used before him, but for some reason historians credit him with inventing it. what I call the layered arcades in a geometric progressive mode. At the ground floor, you have the primary structural bay or span. I can use a musical analogy and refer to this bay as a musical measure. It sets the rhythm of the composition. We go up to the next layer, and he uses 2 arches to span the same distance. And then we look at the upper layer where he has used 4 arches. So I will call this a progression of 1 to 2 to 4 in the structural bay. If we look at the number of floors in each layer, we will see architects often employing a progression in this direction as well. Here, Richardson has the sales floor in the ground floor, 2 floors grouped in the middle, and 1 floor in the top plus dormers. If you look carefully at the middle and top layers, you will see 2 different approaches to detailing the arcade used in this type of elevational composition. In the middle layer, each pier has the same cross-section, creating what we call an AAA rhythm across this face. But in the upper layer, he has created a major-minor rhythm in the cross-sections in the following manner. The major piers immediately above the piers in the lower arcade are larger. He details 4 columns in this location versus the new pier that is between the piers of the lower bay, due to the halving of the spacing of the arch spans, has only 1 column, thereby creating an alternating AB-AB rhythm in this layer. In fact, in one location on each side that I've pointed out, he actually placed 6 columns. This had to be the result of having to make up for a few extra inches that he couldn't quite make the arcade spacing work without, which you can also see where he correspondingly has increased the width of the lower pier at this point. Anyway, Richardson had a choice when he began the design. He could have made each floor the same, with the same window repeated as needed. This I call a logical approach to the design of a building. But here, Richardson has taken a compositional rather than a logical or rational approach to the elevation. He has manipulated the spacing, size, and rhythm of the windows and lines of each floor to achieve a formal purpose. I call this a poetic or lyrical design. One is prose, the other is poetry. One is not inherently better than the other. Tolstoy's War and Peace is not inherently more valuable than Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, or vice versa. 2 different ways of expressing an idea with the same medium, be it literature or architecture. We will see both approaches employed in the design of the first tall office buildings. Lastly, he still has the roofline of the building broken up with his dormer triangular gable walls. He has pushed dormers perpendicular to the main gable roof to gain daylight, but he still gives the wall dominance in that it overrides the roof. Or to say it another way, he holds the roof back of the vertical wall. Either way, the wall is the dominant element. This detail results in what I called Richardson's medieval spiky crown that he places on the top of his buildings, a detail we will see him use time and time again until he gets a commission in Chicago. One last detail. Look under each of the arches. He goes out of his way not to put a mullion in the middle of the span. Either he has no mullions, such as in the dormer arches, or he always divides the semicircular space under an arch into thirds, even though the space immediately below the spring point of the arch is usually divided into halves. He understands that an arch must be expressed as being able to span an opening. Locating a line of support, even that of a mullion, in the middle of an arch invalidates its existence. In both the monochromatic scheme as well as the progression in the layered arcaded elevation, Richardson could easily have been influenced by George Post's New York Produce Exchange, by far the largest and most important building under construction at the time he received the Eames commission. Designed in late 1880, Post had articulated its all-red brick, with no contrasting trim, elevation into 5 distinct horizontal layers. First, a 1-story base in which stores were located. Second, a second layer that was detailed as a 4-story layer, even though it was the location of the 4-story high exchange floor. Third, a third layer that comprised of 2 floors of offices. Fourth, a single story of square-headed windows. And fifth, a cornice story with a continuous arcade. The geometric progression that Post detailed in the elevation was 1 arch to 2 arches to 4 squares. While in the number of floors under each opening ran 4 in the lowest to 2 in the middle and 1 in the top. He's created a perfect counterpuntal visual symmetry. Note that Post did not modulate the arcades into major and minor rhythms, but rather kept the size of the vertical supports in each layer the same, denying the eye's ability to naturally be drawn vertically along the major piers while definitely imparting a horizontal emphasis to the long elevations. The year following the design of the Eames store, 1883, Richardson won the competition to design a new courthouse in Pittsburgh, to replace the one that was destroyed by fire the previous year. There are 2 parts in the complex: a courthouse, which we will review first, and then a jail located at the rear, which was designed later, and so we will look at that after we review the courthouse to understand how Richardson is quickly evolving his design ideas. It looks like a huge, hulking mass of masonry, but remember, all buildings still at this date are hollow in order to maximize the use of daylight. With a conventional office building, an architect would be able to line a lot with these dimensions with a ring of double-loaded corridor offices, leaving the leftover space in the center as a light court. But this is a courthouse, and Richardson has to deal with the fact that some courtrooms are wider than an office, meaning that the problem he faced was that he couldn't rely upon only one wall of windows to light the larger courtrooms because their width is greater than the maximum of 25 feet that one could rely upon to effectively daylight. This problem would have been compounded in Pittsburgh with its smoke pollution. Richardson solved the problem by ringing the site with the larger courtrooms pushed up against the street walls and then placing a corridor around these that lined the inner courtyard. In essence, he had made a single-loaded corridor scheme, but the rooms were now much wider than the typical office floor plan, with the remaining unusable space in the interior of the lot left as an exterior courtyard. The plan is symmetric. Typically, such large buildings at this time were symmetrically planned, as the design was already quite complex, and this tended to lessen the number of variables that an architect had to resolve. The fire had given Pittsburgh a chance to compete with Philadelphia, its cross-state challenger, who was still constructing its Second Empire City Hall designed by John MacArthur. First, this comparison gives us the opportunity to see how much American architecture has changed over the past decade. Out is the mansard roof. Philadelphia's 548-foot tall tower was a pipe dream. Pittsburgh didn't even try to compete with it. Richardson called for a 250-foot tall tower, less than half that of Philadelphia's. As a result, Pittsburgh's will be completed in 1888, while Philadelphia will go on constructing its tower until 1894. Also note the difference in its plan location. While Philadelphia's was pushed back into the courtyard, undoubtedly because its 22-foot thick walls left little interior space for a lobby, while Richardson's shorter tower, with its thinner walls, could be located at the front of the building and yet not obstruct the entry flow into the building. Richardson's massing is a masterful balance of the vertical and the horizontal. The tower is allowed to be a continuous vertical, unbroken by horizontal string courses, while the building's body is articulated into a 3-layer plus roof horizontal composition with the use of horizontal sill courses, while corner pavilions that have their vertical and horizontal lines in complete balance bookend each elevation. Note how he plays the main tower in the front against the pair of shorter towers in the rear. I will explain their function in a minute. He has used a progression in the window openings, but this time he does not align the structure of one layer with that below it, like he had done at the Eames building. He wants this large mass to be horizontal, so he uses an odd number of openings in a 3-to-5 ratio. This disalignment of the structure from one layer to the next emphasizes the individuality of each layer because even the structural lines do not extend into the layer above. Once again, he uses his characteristic rock-faced stone, but curiously, he alternated thin and thick courses. There is only a minimum of carved ornament, and what there was low relief. Again, the smoke pollution would cover most detail, especially that which was finally cut within a year or two. So why go to the expense? The water table expresses the swelling of the bottom of the wall due to the load in it. Once again, he employs a large arched entry with cyclopean voussoirs, from which the tower shoots straight up. Look at the tower. There are no horizontal sill courses, similar to his experiments with the shingle style houses. It is a vertical element which should be expressed as such. Like his earlier shingle houses, he has removed the horizontal layers and simply wrapped the tower with an unbroken surface of stone. In fact, he has wrapped the volume because he has eliminated the sharp angle at each of the tower's corners that would have broken the tower into 4 planes by placing round turrets on each corner. This creates a mass with an undulating surface that shoots into the sky. Within the corner turrets of the tower, which he uses as frames or bookends, he then articulates the surface with a progression of arcades in a 2 to 3 to 4 ratio, creating a false perspective that makes a tower seem taller than it actually is. Look at the top of the corner turrets. Do you see the circles? Remember, I mentioned Richardson's concern over the amount of daylight his spaces would receive due to Pittsburgh's smoke pollution. Well, people have to also breathe this air, and Richardson, after having visited London, a city with a similar problem, was aware of the air cleaning system that had been incorporated in the new Parliament building, so he attempted a similar solution. The tower is as tall as it is so as to try to get above the smoke and draw in fresher air. It is introduced through these circles and then ducted through the 2 turrets at the back of the tower to the basement, where it was cleansed by being drawn through a series of 3 water curtains. In winter, this air was also heated before and after cleansing by being drawn through a series of steam coils, before being ducted into the building's rooms. Stale air was exhausted and sent out the 2 lower towers at the back. It was later proven that the higher air was just as dirty, and so the intakes were moved to the basement so as to provide more intake area than what the tower could provide. Richardson created an entry sequence similar to that of Labroust's in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. You enter under the tower through the main arched portal and into a grand staircase that sets up a number of perspective vistas framed by the intersecting placement of arches that pull you up into the building. The courtyard elevations are simply not as resolved as are the exterior elevations, more than likely due to Richardson's premature death in April 1886. In concept, the courtyard elevations had been determined by Richardson's need to light the larger courtrooms with clerestory windows on the courtyard elevations. He solved this problem by simply holding the corridor ceiling of the courtroom corridors to a single story in height, and then stepped back the courtyard wall to where it became an extension of the courtroom's wall, leaving this surface area open for the large clerestory windows that you can see at the 5th floor level. This step back would reduce the overall usable footprint, so he elevated the main courtroom floor to the 3rd floor level so he could have a maximum of floor area under this level, where he placed 2 floors of county offices, as well as the basement, below the main courtroom floor. In concept, he had layered the building section with the county offices located in the first 2 floors, conveniently placed for public everyday use, while he located the courtrooms above these floors. He then placed a 2nd level of smaller courtrooms above the main courtroom floor. The designers of the courtyard, for I believe Richardson played, at best, a minor role in this part of the design while he was alive, by its lack of resolution, did express this sectional organization somewhat by using a 3-story arcade to face the 2 public floors and basement below the courtroom level, and articulated this functional layering with a continuous sill course immediately above the voussoirs of the main arches. While the semicircular openings that line the corridor of the 2nd floor, which one might argue was designed to be the more public floor due to the functions placed there, I have a hard time justifying the smaller rank of 3 arched windows placed on the 1st floor, for both floors have ostensibly the same function. This smaller arcade seems rather heavy-handed in its detailing, especially in the piers immediately adjacent to the main arcade's piers. But then one is simply dumbfounded by the incorporation of a single pilaster in the basement, while the remaining supports in this layer are all piers. Moving up to the 3 floors of the courtroom's elevation, the main courtroom floor's corridor has been detailed as what appears to be a continuous arcade. And then as one looks more carefully at this arcade, you see that the designer couldn't make up his mind, and at the last moment increased the piers in line with the major piers below, trying to bring this rhythm into the smaller arcade. But it is such a meager gesture, it really is lost in the composition. While this arcade does express the continuous nature of the corridor space, in combination with its anemic sill course, this layer simply isn't sufficient in scale to act neither as a cornice for the 3-story arcade below, nor as a stopping point for the step back above. Lastly, as our eyes move over the step back, we finally come face to face with the clear-story windows of the courtrooms, the raison d'etre for the entire composition. Above these are the corridor windows for the 2nd floor of shallower courtrooms. To complete the courtyard design, because the corridors are located on the courtyard face, each of the building's corners contains a staircase and elevator. His diagonal windows once again express the interior function of these volumes. Now look at these images and tell me how you can tell that he died before this building was completed. Look at what is under each arch. Center mullions, supporting the arches exactly in the middle, something Richardson never would have done. What happened? His employees, as we discussed in relation to the design of the courtyard elevations, were obviously not as sensitive to the importance of detailing as was the master, and they simply drew in continuous mullions, ignorant of Richardson's philosophy. Believe it or not, they also did it in the big windows under the main arcade. Now let's move to the jail he designed to the rear of the courthouse. You can see from this bird's eye view that he lined the site with a 3-story stone wall, placed a support building across the street from the courthouse, which was connected by a bridge, and then designed a 3-wing cruciform plan of multi-story cells to fit within the defined lot, leaving the remaining open spaces for courtyards for the prisoners. Richardson modeled the bridge in concept after the Bridge of Sighs at Venice that links the Doge's palace across the canal to a jail, but in design emulated another famous bridge in Venice, the Rialto Bridge. Here we can contrast the stonework in the courthouse versus that in the jail. Immediately, it is evident that Richardson has treated the jail in a more appropriate manner for a prison. The alternating bands of wide and narrow ashlar of the courthouse are gone. No need for subtleties in a prison. Also, there is no ornamental carving. This is a straightforward, functional building in granite. Also gone is the forced symmetry. The building's massing is a result of the building's function at that location. Gone, too, are the horizontal string courses, just like the earlier Shingle Style houses. The jail is simply a huge rock that Richardson has carved the exterior's functional expression as he worked his way around the site. The only hint of formal geometry is in the plan of the jail cell wings, that was originally to be a 3-armed cross radiating from an octagonal core in which was a guard station, until it was decided to shoehorn in a 4th wing at a 45-degree angle where space permitted. Each wing and cross-section, shown at the upper left, placed a 5-story high row of cells back to back that was inserted into a 6-story high space, held back from the exterior for better sight lines from the guard station. These wings were well lighted by 5-story high arcades that were not touched by the floors of the cells for their entire height. Richardson expressed their unbroken verticality on their exterior by not attempting to layer their elevations with horizontal projections at the floor levels as he had detailed the courthouse's elevations. One could say, accurately, that this was the first vertically accented elevation since the Gothic Revival, a prophecy by Richardson of how one could dress the exterior of the nascent skyscraper. Do not forget this precedent for architects who will face the design of a 10-story elevation. Richardson thought that this complex was one of his best buildings, but he would not live to see it through to completion. Nonetheless, it set an example for American architects to emulate in the design of many courthouses throughout the country, and as we will see in the next two lectures, its soaring vertical tower, unbroken by any applied horizontal projections, in conjunction with its unbroken continuous arcades, will inspire an appropriate new design for a new building type, the tall office building. In 1885, Cincinnati, that had been the largest city west of the Alleghenies until St. Louis finally passed it after the end of the Civil War, held a competition for its new Chamber of Commerce building that was won by Richardson. First, let's look at the overall image of Richardson's design. It's monochromatic, but it's still layered into a base, the trading floor that is lit with a tall arcade that appears to have 3 floors under the arches for a total height of 4 floors, a third layer of 2 floors, in which he has doubled the rhythm of the arches, but still has carried the spacing of the arcade below into this floor with piers, where the intermediate support of the arches are now 3 pilasters, creating an alternating AB-ABA rhythm, and a roof layer of 1 floor, in which the lower pier spacing is not continued, but actually inverted with the placement of a square-headed opening. This is integrated with Richardson's signature dormered gables, once again resulting in the medieval crown that I have identified as Richardson's preferred roofline. Also note that he has turned each corner of the building by locating a turret there. Just like his tower in Pittsburgh, he has eliminated the building's sharp corners of 2 planes intersecting at a 90-degree angle in exchange for a 3-dimensional wrapping of the surface, emphasizing the massiveness of the stone and its volume, not its planar surface. On the interior, he has created a column-free exchange floor on the second level by clear-spanning the entire floor with 4-story-high iron trusses from which he hung 3 floors of office space, a detail he took from the Chicago Board of Trade that had just opened, and was one of the major reasons for Cincinnati to respond with this competition. Speaking of Chicago, I have not mentioned that city or any of its buildings in any of my lectures up to this point. I will do so, starting with the next lecture that discusses the invention of the skyscraper, but I also want to discuss this next project now so I can complete Richardson's inventory of designs prior to his being commissioned by Marshall Field to design a new store in Chicago. Richardson was commissioned by John J. Glessner, a Chicago businessman who was a managing partner of a farm implements company that would be merged in 1902 with 3 other firms to create the International Harvester Corporation. He commissioned Richardson in May 1885 to design a new house for him in the city's fashionable South Prairie Avenue district, whose residents included Marshall Field, Philip D. Armour, and George Pullman. In fact, Glessner's site was diagonally across from Pullman's house, from where this view was taken. What we see are large suburban boxes, be they Victorian or Second Empire in style, sitting back from the street in a field of grass. The date of the commission is critical to gaining a complete understanding of the ideas that generated Richardson's final solution. I don't have the time here to give you a complete lecture about the socio-political climate in Chicago in May 1885, when Richardson traveled to Chicago to interview the Glessners, so a summary must suffice. First, the tone of the class warfare that was underway in Chicago had been set by the Paris Commune versus the French national government battle that had culminated on March 28, 1871, the anniversary of which had been marked since March 28, 1872, by an annual protest parade of Chicago's radicals. This first march had been through the ashes and debris left by Chicago's own fire, which occurred merely 6 months after the Paris fires, for which many of Chicago's ruling class were still suspicious about the role that the city's own radicals had played in the conflagration. For the memories of the Paris Revolt, where the communards had blown up and fired many of Paris's important buildings, and the corresponding killing of over 20,000 Parisians during the week-long conflict were still fresh in these people's minds when Chicago burned. Many of Chicago's upper class had visited Paris before and after the Commune, and had many French friends who had sobered them with stories of their personal tribulations during the Commune. Following the economic crash of 1873, the campaign by working-class labor unions began for the 8-hour workday. In October 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions had held its annual convention in Chicago, where it had lit the fuse for a time bomb to go off on Saturday, May 1st, 1886. Today, they had determined to be the start of a grand nationwide workers' walkout to protest in favor of the 8-hour workday. 6 weeks later, Chicago's International Communist-sanctioned International Working People's Association had sponsored a Poor People's March on Thanksgiving Day, 1884. Following the black flag of hunger and anarchism and the red flag of international socialism, they purposefully walked past the homes of the rich and famous to the tune of Les Massiers, stopping in front of the homes of the wealthier industrialists long enough for verbal epithets to be hurled at those celebrating the annual feast behind their bolted doors. Chicago's new Board of Trade was scheduled to open the coming May 1st, 1885. A grand gala and banquet was scheduled for the night of April 28th to celebrate it. The morning of the great banquet, a riot at the McCormick Reaper plant broke out between Pinkerton agents who had been hired by McCormick to protect the workers he had hired to replace those striking in favor of the 8-hour day. Coincidentally, the IWPA had scheduled a mass parade to protest the new Board of Trade that same evening, not knowing in advance that the McCormick strike was going to erupt into a full-fledged riot on the same day. The parade's band struck up Les Massiers, the marchers linked arms, and followed the lead red flags east on Lake Street and then down LaSalle Street. Fortunately for all of the parties involved, cooler heads than those at the McCormick plant prevailed. This is but a quick overview of the atmosphere of mistrust between the upper and working classes in Chicago when Richardson sat down with Mr. and Mrs. Glesner to discuss what they wanted in their new house. Richardson spotted this photo of an English farm structure on one of the Glesner's walls and asked Mrs. Glesner if she liked it. She answered yes, and he replied, "Then I'll make that the keynote to your home. Give it to me, please." Richardson took the photo and their ideas back to Boston and started designing. He produced an entirely new approach to a Chicago house. Instead of the setback freestanding suburban box, he designed an urban Florentine Renaissance palazzo, pushed right up to the line of the sidewalk. Judging by the fortress-like image it presents to the street, protecting his family from the street mob and concerns over having his children kidnapped were, indeed, a major concern for Glesner. Note, there are no windows that a human could enter on the ground level, and with the exception of the 4 windows for the master bedroom and the parlor on the Prairie Avenue facade, there were only a number of tall but thin rectangular windows along the 18th Street elevation intended to provide light for the servants' corridor located against this wall, which, in a moment's notice, could just as easily be used as rifle slits. And that the only 2 doors have a balcony immediately above for defensive purposes. When one understands the unique functional planning Richardson employed, one could say that the Glesner house was the first modern house. Meanwhile, the time bomb set for May 1st, 1886 continued to tick. On March 28th, with little more than 5 weeks before the day, 1,500 people celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Commune in Chicago at a German Turner Hall in anticipation of the great day to come. On Easter Sunday, April 25th, buildings on the west side of Chicago were bedecked with red banners flowing. The Central Labor Union had organized a march reported to have involved over 15,000 people, forming a procession over 2 miles in length that marched among the red flags of the IWPA that day. 2 days later, the 47-year-old Richardson finally succumbed to his chronic bout with Bright's disease. On Saturday, May 1st, 1886, D-Day, over 80,000 marched down Michigan Avenue with red flags unfurled. It was reported that between 40,000 and 60,000 had struck in Chicago peacefully in support of the National General Strike. Reports came in from throughout the country that over 350,000 had stopped work altogether. That night, the beer halls and bars of Chicago, the center of the storm, were alive with talk of the success and what was to come next. Meanwhile, Chicago's business leaders were readying their own plans. For those among the city's elite had had enough of this socialist-inspired revolution and had convinced the city's leaders to station a force of 200 policemen to put a stop to any attempt to convince their non-union workers to stop work and join the union movement. On Monday, the first full day for the 8-hour day, the police wasted no time in dispersing the mob of strikers with clubs and pistols. Class warfare, once again, had been engaged in the streets of Chicago. Chicago's anarchists called a mass meeting to protest for the following evening, Tuesday, May 4th, a day that still lives in history. During the meeting that night, a bomb was thrown into a group of policemen, igniting what is called, depending upon your political leanings, the Haymarket Square affair, riot, or bombing. The final recorded death toll included 8 policemen, at least 4 bystanders, and 7 of the 8 anarchist leaders who were rounded up in the ensuing dragnet and found guilty of murder. The final fatality was the 8-hour movement, at least for the next 2 decades. 2 weeks later, the construction contract for the Glessner House was signed. The Glessners' concerns over the safety of their family seemed to have been justified. Richardson made few revisions to his initial design prior to his death, primarily to simplify the massing. He had replaced the hip roof over the Prairie Avenue wing with his by now trademark triangular gable of stone, which was simply a mirror image to what he had detailed in the Pittsburgh jail. He continued his latest design ideas. Similar to his recent Shingle Style houses and the Pittsburgh jail, there were no continuous horizontal projections to break the mass into horizontal layers. The Glessner House was treated as a volumetric sculpture in stone, but still capped with a medieval crown in the form of the triangular gables. He had shrunk the stair turret to be absorbed into the building's body, as he had done with the Stoughton House. And lastly, the house's exterior was also to be erected in a monochromatic rock-faced stone. And most interestingly, he downplayed the front door, first by eliminating the gable dormer over it, and by filling in the curved portion of its arched portal, while he left the grand arched service entry on 18th Street untouched. It was almost as if he and the Glessners wanted to trick any would-be attackers to focus on the service door and away from the front door. Fortunately, the site that Glessner had purchased was located on the south side of 18th Street, facing north. It was so oriented that Richardson could line the 2 street fronts with solid walls, like a Florentine palazzo, that would protect the interior from the severe winter winds from the north and off Lake Michigan, and still be able to allow the sun to light and heat during the winter the interior of the house and its exterior yard. He pushed the building's rooms up against these protective walls so as to maximize the lot's exterior courtyard. This was 180 degrees different from the typical Prairie Avenue house that was a Victorian box set back from the street and within a plane of grass. Richardson's experimental asymmetrical and unconventional massing had generated a new, dare I say, modern image. His neighbor, the railroad sleeper car magnate George Pullman, would often complain, quote, "I do not know what I have ever done to have that thing staring me in the face every time I go out my front door," unquote. In conjunction with the adjacent house's southern wall and the Glessners' attached coach house, the courtyard was completely enclosed. It was as if the Glessners had turned their backs to the rabble of the street and had created their own little Garden of Eden. Richardson had completely inverted the residential model of Chicago. Instead of putting the house in the middle of a grassed lot, he had put the grass lot inside of the house. The floor plan of the Glessner house was not dissimilar in concept to Richardson's plan of the Pittsburgh jail. The only difference being, the jail walls were designed to keep the inmates in, while the Glessner house was designed to keep the street mob out. I had noted that in Boston's Trinity Church, Richardson had incorporated a number of interior fixtures designed and manufactured by the British arts and crafts leader William Morris. During his European trip in 1882, Richardson had the good fortune to run into Morris while in London, and the two of them had spent a few days together discussing their shared professional interests. The Glesners were also keen followers and collectors of the arts and craft movement, having a few Morris's pieces in their own house. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that in the plan for the Glesner house, one could argue that he had been influenced by William Morris's Red House. Once again, we have the Pugin-inspired L plan with the attached carriage house enclosing the remaining courtyard. The front entry and circulation systems are quite similar to the Red House, with the exception that Richardson has moved the stairway and servant corridor to the back or north wall, which had the added advantage of insulating the hall, dining room, and parlor from the winter north winds. While Richardson has had to elongate the longer arm of the L to move the dining room farther from the corner of the house to make room for the parlor, both houses still place the dining room with its kitchen and servant spaces at the end of the longer of the two arms of the L. The house was a completely integrated design, the reason I call it a modern house. In addition to the security issues, Richardson also maximized the site's orientation from an environmental standpoint. Remember, the site is on the southwest corner of the intersection, so Richardson's two mighty stone walls face north and east, also to protect the house from the winter winds coming off Lake Michigan to the east. The amount of glass used in the courtyard elevations allowed views from the interior to the courtyard, and daylight and solar heat during the cold winters to enter into the interior spaces that opened to the south. But if one only saw the courtyard elevations of the house, you would never associate them with the mighty stone fortress that shows on the exterior, for Richardson faced the interior courtyard with an appropriately residential scaled common Chicago brown brick. The only stone used was in the window trimmings. He has given the Glesners a model of domesticity in the design of the courtyard. Mrs. Glesner was the leading socialite within the prestigious Prairie Avenue neighborhood, renowned for her parties. The house was designed to accommodate the arrival and departure of such important guests. Arriving in their carriage, they would first pass through an iron door at the far south end of the Prairie Avenue facade and into a porte cochere blocked by a portcullis, that is, a second iron gate that would prevent a would-be intruder from slipping past the opened front door and into the courtyard. The iron door would be closed before the second gate would be opened. See the opening in the upper right-hand image, allowing the carriage to continue to the drop-off in the courtyard. Richardson and the Glesners completed their homage to William Morris by incorporating a number of his designs throughout the interior of the house. In summary, Richardson had designed a wonderful, fully integrated modern building to live in, as well as to defend one's family if necessary. If we review the last 5 projects designed by Richardson, the Eames store, the Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail, the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce, and lastly, the Glesner House, one is struck by the overall formal similarities between the Eames store, the courthouse, and the Chamber of Commerce, designed within the relatively short span of only 3 years. Especially noteworthy is Richardson's continued use of the picturesque, steep-sloped roof, punctuated by high-pitched dormers, what I refer to as his medieval crown. All 3 designs exhibit his favorite roof detail, that is, allowing a dormer to extend to the exterior wall line of the building, where it is intersected by the vertical projection of the wall plane beyond the eave of the roof until the wall blends into the dormer's gable. This detail denied any chance for the wall to end in a Renaissance-like horizontal cornice, which could conceivably hide his beloved roof from an observer on the ground. Even the Pittsburgh jail and the Glesner house can be seen to be in Richardson's family of gabled roof wall intersections. Here, however, in a smaller size project, it appears that he felt free to experiment with unconventionally asymmetric, almost awkward or idiosyncratic forms as a way to achieve a truly modern American architecture, not unlike what Furness was attempting to do at the same time. As one reviews Richardson's designs following his return from his tour of Europe in 1882, be they small residential projects or large urban blocks, one constant formal theme is quite evident. The roof of a building designed by Richardson at this time was an important, indispensable part of the building that had to be architectonically celebrated. Many times this was accomplished with the extended dormer gable, but it still signaled the presence of a roof. In no project, built or unbuilt, prior to his arrival in Chicago in May 1885, had H. Richardson ever contemplated a palazzo box building with a flat cornice. In this lecture, we have reviewed Richardson's career to the Glessner House, as well as a few buildings from Chicago. And so it's time that we now look at Chicago and its place in architectural history, which of course includes its role in the development of the American skyscraper, which I will discuss in the next two lectures. This is necessary if we are to understand how Richardson's architecture will be influenced by what he sees there when he visits the Glessners in May 1885, and what he does in response to what he sees, as well as how his response correspondingly impacts Chicago's architecture after 1885.